I just really think this case is really at the inflection point, the hinge in Jim Crow justice. If it had occurred 10 years earlier, maybe you don't find a state Supreme Court that's going to look at this and say, oh, this is a railroaded black man. But in this case, I think you're really seeing the courts turn on the idea of how justice works out for black men during Jim Crow, during segregation.
Hello and welcome to See You in Court, the podcast that informs you about the Georgia civil justice system, what it means to you, and how it protects individual rights. This podcast is a collaboration between the Georgia Civil Justice Foundation and the Georgia Institute of Technology. Your hosts are Robin Fraser Clark and Lester Tate, who are both past presidents of the State Bar of Georgia and currently serve on the board of directors of the Georgia Civil Justice Foundation. And now this episode of See You in Court.
Good morning, friends and lovers of the law, and welcome to See You in Court. I am Robin Fraser Clark, and with me is my co-host extraordinaire, Lester Tate. Hey, Lester, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm extraordinaire, so I'm very happy about that, and very happy to see 2021 in the rearview mirror, and to be doing our first See You in Court podcast of 2022, and I think we're getting this will be year 2 for us, won't it, or year 3? I can't remember.
I think we started in 2020. That's a good question.
Right.
We'll have to check, but we're rolling right along. And I was telling you before that I have a case scheduled for trial starting January 31st in Fulton County State Court, and I'm just keeping my fingers crossed that nothing interferes with that, like lack of jurors or something like that. So,
well, up here in rural Bartow County, I noted that the New York Times numbers this morning showed that in the last 2 weeks we had a 399% increase in COVID. So I'm sure it's more than that downtown. So I wouldn't send my subpoenas out just yet.
Yeah, we'll see. Keeping fingers in all extremities crossed.
And I'm really glad to have. I'm really glad to have. I know you're going to do his bio, but I'm really glad to have Chris Joyner here today. And I just want to say, Chris, that Robin and I have long advocated an Emmy for your wife, who did a video with Robin and I when she was president of the State Bar. I was past president, and it was called Maker's Mark, the official, unofficial drink of the State Bar of Georgia. And I thought she should have won an Emmy or a Pulitzer or something, for that. And so we keep trying to nominate her and haven't been successful yet.
It's durable content, that's for sure.
Right.
You can always bring that out.
That's right.
Well, it still ages well because that's still what Lester and I drink. So
that's right.
But we're good friends of Chris's wife. But let me just introduce our listeners to Chris. We're delighted to have Chris Joyner with us today. He's a journalist with the Atlanta Journal and Constitution, and now has authored a book. The title is The 3 Death Sentences of Clarence Henderson. And we are looking forward to diving into this book and what I believe is a sordid piece of history in Georgia that Chris is going to tell us a little bit about. But let me tell you a little bit more about Chris. He is an Atlanta native. He has a master's degree in history from the University of Southern Mississippi with an undergrad in history from the University of West Georgia. Chris has worked in newspapers in Georgia, Tennessee, and Mississippi for more than 25 years. Most of that time has been spent as an investigative reporter. He has been a member of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's investigations team since coming to the paper in 2010. Chris lives in DeKalb County, Georgia, with his wife, Kathleen, and his 2 children. This is his first book. And when not working or writing, Chris coaches youth baseball and drives his daughter to ballet. He is not asked to coach ballet. Good move. You can read more about Chris at his LinkedIn profile, which is linkedin.com/n/Chris Joyner. 3912859. And you can also follow him on Twitter and read his articles in the AJC and AJC.com. So we're excited to have Chris. And Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. I appreciate you having me.
We're glad you're here. Let's talk a little bit about, let's just talk first about your journey to bring us together today to write a book. You write for a living, obviously. You've been writing all your life. What was the impetus behind this book, or, what was the catalyst to say, now I'm going to do it, I'm going to write a book?
Well, I'd actually been carrying this project with me since really my first years in newspapers. My first job in journalism was at the Times-Georgian in Carrollton, Georgia, where I was hired as a general assignment reporter after many years in graduate school training to be a historian. I'd sort of backed into journalism a little bit, but still thought a lot like a historian as I was learning the craft of journalism. And it was during that time, this would have been the late 90s, that my father had mentioned the death of Buddy Stevens. Now, my father went to West Georgia College when it was a 2-year school back in the 1940s, and that's in Carrollton, and knew Buddy Stevens as a townie. They ran in sort of adjacent circles, I think. And when Buddy Stevens was killed in 1948, it circulated pretty quickly within the small alumni circle of West Georgia College. So it was something that he remembered. So when I got a job at the newspaper in Carrollton, Dad had said, you ought to pull down one of those bound volumes of the old newspapers there and look at that murder case. He says, I don't think they ever figured out who did that. And he didn't really remember much more about that. So as a young reporter, I went and grabbed the 1948 volume of the Georgian from the archive and started flipping through it, and just became really deeply interested in this story. It was a really salacious murder. There was an intense manhunt. It was clearly, a story that, was everyone in that community was talking about. And as I got deeper and deeper into it, I would end up spending my weekends in the library looking through microfilm of the newspaper, and also the Atlanta Constitution and the Atlanta Journal during that period. Making thousands of pages of printouts and putting them carefully in notebooks and organizing them by subject. And then I got another job, and I went to another newspaper, and I put all that research in a box, and I packed it up to my next newspaper, and then the newspaper after that, and then the newspaper after that, until I came back to Atlanta in 2010. But even so, it wasn't until I had listened to the podcast Serial, the first season of it, that I really started thinking deeply about this project again. Because what is it about Serial? I mean, this is it was a murder involving people you'd never heard of in a place that you don't live. What was it that made Serial such a engrossing story? And it was really in the telling of it, and how deeply the narrators, the reporters, and in the case of Serial, would go into the topic and really examine it. And I thought, I've got a story that's like that. And one night I just reached into into that cardboard box and pulled out one of the notebooks and opened it up and started refamiliarizing myself with the case. And 5 or so short years later, here we are with the book.
And in between that, you got married and had 2 kids, and you have a full-time job. So I can imagine it's pretty difficult thing to write an entire book.
Yeah, not for the faint of heart.
And before we go on, I wanted to say that you put in your acknowledgments that you dedicated this book to your father. And you thanked your father, Van B. Joyner Jr., who was proud of his son's work, but did not live to see it completed. So I'm sorry about that, but I know how influential and important a parent's work can be for a son, and how important that was to you. So I thought that was really lovely that you put that in your acknowledgments and you dedicated the book to your father.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, one of the things that a couple of things just really identified with me with it. One, I don't know if you know this about me, but I grew up in Cedartown, Georgia, which is sort of shares a main street with Carrollton, just up Highway 27. And also the murder victim was a Georgia Tech student, which is where I went to college. But one of the enduring things sort of that hit me was I had read the book, The Devil in the Grove, which is about Thurgood Marshall defending the Grove Boys. And this seems to be about the same time period, and just fascinating sort of reading. And it seems to me, and Robin had said sort of in our pre-exchange that it reminded her a little of To Kill a Mockingbird. And I think in To Kill a Mockingbird, Macomb is sort of a character in the book. And it seemed to me that Carrollton is sort of a character as well. So can you tell us a little bit what Carrollton was like in 1948?
Sure. And I agree with you. I think Carrollton is a character in the book, and sort of a stand-in for a lot of communities coming out of World War II. Carrollton at the time was a really ambitious community for what it had been up until 1945 or so, which was a real sort of outpost, and at times a real almost lawless outpost. And it really saw itself as on the precipice of becoming something really special. They had a lot going for them in that they had a growing college, which was really important after World War II, because the GI Bill saw that college just explode as soldiers came back and started their college education at West Georgia. And it also had some major employers. It had some good connections, and there's really an opportunity for Carrollton to become this sort of like progressive Southern community that was, white collar, professional, had a lot of employment prospects in Southwire, which started there, which makes copper wire, and a lot of the things you would expect out of a community. There's also the county seat, so there's like a legal community there. There was a medical community that was there, so in 1948, when Buddy Stevens was killed, the community was really rocked by the murder, in part because of the type of murder that it was. And just to set it up, Buddy Stevens was a 21-year-old Georgia Tech student, a veteran who had served in the Army in the years immediately after VJ Day. He was stationed overseas as a military police officer in the immediate post-war period. He come back. He was at Georgia Tech. He was the son of a prominent white family, and he was dating a beauty pageant winner named Nan Turner in Carrollton. And the two of them were abducted by a masked man, and it would later turn out that this masked man had been conducting serial rapes by abducting women from Lover's Lane areas. And Buddy, this guy finally ran into somebody that didn't run away. That was Buddy, who was, back from the Army. He didn't run and abandon his date, and was killed protecting her. That kind of random violent crime was jarring to a community like Carrollton. because it had so much at stake in what it anticipated it would become. And this really threatened a lot of sort of what was underpinning that, this idea that it was going to be a progressive community, that it was an area that, because immediately they started looking for a black suspect who was attacking white women. That was the belief anyway. It injected a lot of racial politics, a lot of gender politics into the crime. The whole thing was very, very traumatic for the community. And so, yeah, I do agree with you that Carrollton is an important character. And in that way, a lot like a lot of other communities around the nation during that period where they were trying to capitalize on coming out of the war and the Depression and, looking towards a bright future in a time when nothing really was guaranteed.
Tell us a little bit about the name. The name of the book is the 3 death sentences of Clarence Henderson. So, kind of joked about that it's a spoiler in the title of the book. We kind of know what happens, but tell us how does Clarence Henderson get involved in this, and really becomes the point to me sounds like we're gonna find somebody to pin this on, regardless of whether he's really guilty. And it turned out the guy they're going to try to pin it on is Clarence Henderson, largely because he was black.
And not only that, they had to find someone who sort of fit a profile they were looking for. So Clarence Henderson was a sharecropper and a gambler, and he also ran liquor in a dry county. He was a brawler, not particularly well liked among the black community even. And so when the white establishment in Carrollton started looking for a suspect, they didn't have anything to work on, really. Buddy Stevens was killed, obviously, and his date, Nan Turner, never saw her attacker. It was a new moon night. It was raining. It was dark. The man was masked and shining a flashlight at them the whole time, so she never got a look at it. The only thing they had to go on was Nan eventually would say that she thought he sounded black. She was not even particularly clear on that, but over time would become more clear, as the pressure built on her testimony, that, we needed as much as we can to identify this person as being black. But with that little bit, the manhunt for Buddy Stevens' murderer, white police held and questioned well over a dozen black men. They eventually indicted a man named Tyler North, who they carried over from term to term, and then eventually did not prosecute for that crime. So it was about 18 months after the murder before they arrested Clarence Henderson on the basis of they believed they had found the murder weapon in a pawn shop in Atlanta, and through a series of really sort of complicated transactions, they believed they had put the murder weapon in Clarence's hands for sort of just the precise period that he would have needed to have had it to have shot Buddy Stevens.
So one of the things too that there's really so much going on in this book, which is I find fascinating. There's the civil rights part of it. There's the sort of justice part of it. There's the communism part of it, but also it's sort of at the advent of forensics. As forensic science as used in murder all kinds of investigations. And now we see CSI, on TV. I think we're going to have CSI Ackworth next. There's one in every different town. And you talk a little bit about how they're using this this thing called a polygraph. And there's, to me, fascinating issue about ballistics. And I remember I'm a gun owner and a little bit of a gun guy. And I remember, 1948, a 9mm, they found a 9mm slug killed the victim, but 9mm weren't that prevalent, at least in the United States, I think, around that time.
And more problematic, the gun that they had was a .38 revolver.
Right, didn't shoot a 9mm. So can you talk a little bit about that and about the sort of forensic involvement? And I think one of the characters too in there is fancies himself as sort of the father of forensic science in Georgia.
Right. That's Dr. Herman Jones, who the State Crime Lab is named after now. So, yeah, in this case, initially when they retrieved the 9mm bullet from Buddy Stevens in the autopsy, Herman Jones made comments to the media at the time, as the State Crime Lab chief, that they would be looking for an automatic pistol because that seemed logical. It was only later that they discovered that the scarring on the bullet would not match an automatic, that they believed that it had to have been shot from a revolver. And at this time, forensics and this sort of ballistic forensics was still pretty novel in a lot of, cases. It'd been around for a little while, but it wasn't as sort of entrenched a science as we consider it now. And Herman Jones was sort of on the forefront of that, and particularly in the South. He was a modernizer of criminology from the scientific standpoint. In Georgia and really across the Southeast. They called him the crime doctor. And, the media was just so fascinated with the crime lab and everything that he had accomplished. Now, and he was coming off a big success, a really high profile success in the what's known as the murder in Coweta County, if people are familiar with that trial of wealthy
John
land.
Lewis. The commissioner of Meriwether County, I think that Andy Griffith. The only time I ever knew that Andy Griffith played a bad guy was in that movie, I think. Right.
Andy Griffith was the bad guy, and Johnny Cash was the crusading sheriff in that movie, right?
Right.
But one of the real hero of that trial was Herman Jones, who had used forensic evidence to establish that a murder had been committed. So, what role the ballistic evidence plays in the trials is, I think, really interesting, because in the first trial, it's not challenged at all. It's sort of I describe it as sort of like a wizardry, and as far as it's described to the jury, it is incontrovertible evidence that this 9mm round had been fired from this .38 special revolver, and then so the only question is who was holding it when it was fired. And then by the third trial, we see a much more sophisticated attack on the ballistic evidence from Clarence Henderson's defense. So I think you're right that part of it is, I think, really a fascinating part of it. And in some ways, you talk about there's a lot going on in this story. It's a terrible elevator pitch because there is so much going on in the story, but this story really could not unfold the way it did without the rise of the civil rights movement during this period, the fear of communism during this period, the rise of sort of a scientific approach to police work during this period, and some real challenges in the courtroom in terms of how African Americans were being handled in the courtrooms as well. So I think all those things have to, conspire to make this a really interesting story.
What's your evaluation of the journalism covering this trial? Because that's changed a lot too over the years. I think in one of the AJC, well, it would have been the AJC, maybe the Atlanta Constitution or the Atlanta Journal, but one of those articles I think you quoted is saying it described him as a husky Negro or a husky black man or something like that, right, which is not the kind of stuff you see in the newspaper, today.
Yeah. I mean, they're very much products of their period. And, when we look back on this period of journalism, we will no doubt see things in print that we are saying, well, that's not the way we would do it today. But looking back at 1948, 1949, 1950, that you could really see a lot of the community pressures that are playing out and the way that particularly like the Carroll County Georgian and the Times Free Press, the two competing newspapers in Carrollton, were covering, really sort of breathlessly every aspect of this trial. One of the things I really think about when I think about the journalism is how fortunate I was to be looking at a period where there were distinct voices in journalism. You had the Black press, you had the national press, you had the Atlanta press and the Carrollton press, all involved in reporting out not only the murder and then the eventual arrest of Clarence Henderson, but 3 separate trials. And there was so much that you could, by triangulating those different perspectives, learn about that period and the story.
I was just, I had some places marked about Stanley Parkman, who was, I guess, the editor of the Georgian in Carroll. That's in Carrollton, right? That's the Carrollton.
That's in Carrollton, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Paper.
And really the only person in this book that I knew in life.
Okay. I wondered about that. So to me, there's a lot of ambiguity with each person, because sometimes you think they're going to be a hero against segregation. Other times they say something, you're like, wait a minute, I thought that guy was against segregation. I thought that guy was for justice. And Stanley Parkman seemed kind of that ambiguous character. On page 276, you wrote that he said, he's talking about Governor Talmadge. He said, Governor Talmadge knows better than we do that the races will never be mixed in the schools of Georgia. He wrote an editorial shortly after the November ballot issue went down to defeat. He knows better than we do that Negroes and whites never have and never will dance together in the municipal auditorium of Atlanta or anywhere else in Georgia. So to me, I highlighted that because I thought that was shocking. I thought Stanley Parkman was going to come out as a hero of justice and desegregation, and then he puts something like that in an editorial. That surprised me.
Sure, and if I were writing the screenplay or if this were a novel, I would probably make Stanley Parkman less complicated. But he was in a complicated position in a complicated time.
Right.
He was, by many ways of looking at that period, a fairly progressive newspaper publisher for where he lived and when he lived. He was for clean government, and he was for investing in the community and making Carrollton everything that it could be. But at the same time, he's a white man who grew up on a plantation in the 1920s and also had a tremendous amount to risk as the publisher of a startup paper in Carrollton. So he is in that sense a product of his period. I knew him much later in life, when he was publisher emeritus of the Times Georgian, and had an opportunity to talk to him about this story, which the death of Buddy Stevens and the trials that followed were the story of his career, really. Mm-hmm. And there was never anything that sort of captured the imagination in that same sort of way. And he remembers it, vividly. He remembered it vividly. He's passed away now, but I think to present him without, outside of his time would not be, historically accurate. And then in the same way it goes for a lot of these people when we talk about, who are the heroes or who are the villains of these stories. They all have, everyone is a hero of their own story. And certainly many of them saw themselves as heroic in what they were doing. It's only in backwards looking fashion that we can sort of say, well, you were wrong there. You were wrong there, Stanley. We will be dancing together.
He was dead wrong about that. Yeah. Thank goodness.
I mentioned The Devil in the Grove earlier, and it kind of.
And wait, Lester, 1 second though. One thing I do want to point out about that quote is that when Stanley Parkman was saying that we know better than Governor Talmadge, what he was saying is we don't need Governor Talmadge and his program of massive reaction to civil rights. In his way, it was a progressive statement, even if he was defending segregation. He was trying, and a lot of people in that region were fighting against what they saw as the retrograde nature of Talmadgism during that period. They're still, they carried with them the prejudices of the time, but I think at that moment, 1951, Stanley Parkman probably felt like he was being pretty progressive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sorry.
No. And one of the things I was going to say, which you sort of lead into this because you're talking about how people viewed civil rights. And in the book that I referred to earlier, the Devil in the Grove, they quote one of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund leaders as saying, these segregationist congressmen and senators and governors would like nothing better than to paint us pink, meaning to, attach the Communist Party. And we're talking about the McCarthy era, really as well here. And that seems to have come more into play in your book and in your scenario, maybe than others. And you address that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it was one of the real page turning aspects of the research. When I started looking into how the Buddy Stevens investigation proceeded and who they arrested and how they were bringing to trial, I can remember very vividly turning to a colleague of mine and saying, do you know the communists got involved in this? Because it was just totally unexpected. But the deeper research shows that, this was the kind of story that in 1948, 49, 50, the Communist Party of the United States was really sitting on. These cases where Black men were being accused of crimes particularly against white women, and railroaded through the Jim Crow justice system in the South was a real, I think, they were legitimately appalled by it because of their outlook, but they also saw it as a great opportunity to enhance their image among African Americans in the South if they would come to the defense of these Black men in such jeopardy. The book goes into, in particular, the Scottsboro boys case in Alabama, which was really nearby, that it had occurred some years earlier. But in a similar way, the first people to really come to the defense of Clarence Henderson after his first trial, and as you know, that first trial was gavel to gavel one day, and he was sentenced to the electric chair. But in the appeal process, the first people to come to his defense were communist organizers, and in particular one Homer Chase, who was the head of the Georgia Communist Party and sort of head organizer of the communist effort in the state. And that was a real problem for civil rights activists, Black civil rights activists in Atlanta, who were also concerned about this, because as you say, if you're pushing for civil rights as a Black man on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, and you are standing next to a communist organizer, you are more vulnerable than you would otherwise be, because you can be painted as not going after an unjust system, but as a tool of the Soviet Union, a communist dupe. And that was something that the NAACP was really, really concerned about during this period. It was sort of purging communist and socialist elements out of their ranks, so that they could, sort of laser focus on the particularly the legal issues surrounding segregation.
Well, I learned a lot about that. I had no idea how communism played a role in that. I learned quite a bit about it. Some of it was shocking to me, how they treated alleged communists. It was mind-boggling to me, and took away their constitutional rights and wouldn't let them have any sort of freedom of the press or freedom to say anything. Banish people from this county because you're an alleged communist. And that, to me, it sounded like fiction, but it really happened, apparently.
Oh, and it was. I mean, and again, this goes back to this sort of like, the competing optimism and paranoia of that post-World War II period. This feeling that the United States was really on the precipice of great things, but there was so much at risk because of the outside influence of the Soviet Union, or the racial problems that were sort of built into the system, particularly in the South, but also everywhere in the United States. So, I mean, it was a fragile, and there's sort of a fragile psyche of the early 1950s.
And I think I'm right about this. I want you to correct me if I'm wrong. But when you're talking about communists, then now it's become in vogue to call anybody that has more progressive views than whoever it is, they're a communist. And that kind of came through with the McCarthy era, where there was sort of a communist behind every tree, according to Joe McCarthy. But the folks that you're talking about here weren't people that were labeled communists by their opponents. They were people who labeled themselves communists.
These were, legitimate, as they used to say, card-carrying communists. They were members of the Communist Party of the United States of America, affiliated with the Communist International. And these were, and they had a vision for America that was distinctly different than you would find in Carrollton or on the streets of Atlanta for a lot of places. But they, as part of that vision, they really saw the road to socialist revolution in the United States ran through the South and through civil rights. And so they were intensely interested in embedding themselves inside the civil rights movement if they could. Civil rights leaders, particularly African-American civil rights leaders, were interested in, maintaining their movement for themselves, for their own goals, not for the goals of the Communist Party. So there's a real tension there that's working itself out during this period. And how communists were treated during this period was, some of it's just really amazing. And there's a part in this book where there is a 5-day long peace bond hearing is essentially, it was a restraining order hearing. It went on a week long with openings and closings, and it was all about whether or not the communist organizer for the state, again, a man named Homer Chase, should have to put up a peace bond because he was accused of harassing a grocery store clerk in Woodstock. And that was happening, though, at the same time on the national stage. There were big trials of the communist leadership in New York, real show trials where they were really dismantling the leadership of the Communist Party for sedition. And so, this is another case of where, these smaller actions in Georgia were being played out in a much grander way throughout the nation.
Yeah. And another quote of Stanley Parkman in another editorial in the Georgian, you quote him as saying, it has seemed a little on the ridiculous side all along for us to continue spending time and money in the courts, extending the long arm of freedom to characters like Chase. Our Constitution never intended that liberty should go so far. I marked an exclamation mark with unbelievable in the margin on that. That's just mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, although it is something that you could very well hear in today's sort of bifurcated political discussions when you hear, say, someone who is a very conservative voter talk about Black Lives Matter. I mean, that sort of, overheated rhetoric is not something that we've grown out of, apparently.
So, one of the things too that struck me is, so the murder was Halloween of 1948, and the first trial was in January of 1950, and you said it was about 18 months after the murder before Clarence was charged. Then there's a second trial in October of 1950, and then a third trial in October of 1951. And, now, to have a murder case go to trial that, even pre-COVID, I mean, the COVID has slowed everything down, but the speed at which got not one, but three trials was just pretty incredible. So and I don't feel like I'm giving away the book when you're talking about a factual thing. It's like, watching Titanic, the ship goes down,
Oh yeah, no, this is definitely how did we get there? Not where did we end up?
Right. And so could you just give us a thumbnail sketch of how he got three murder trials in
2.5 years?
Yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and what's really amazing is that you look at the commentary at the time, they were wondering what was taking so long. So they were really used to, and now the judge here was Judge Samuel Boykin, who wielded incredible authority over the, sort of the civic life of Carroll County. And his grand jury presentments were, were covered in, tremendous detail. It's like going over scripture or something. You'd look at what the grand jury would return in terms of like what should happen with the schools, or what should happen with the roads, or how should the taxes be adjusted. These were all things that he weighed in on through his grand juries. And when it came to operating his courtroom, he was an extremely efficient jurist. And he wanted, he did not like continuances. He was reluctant to grant them. Even on a case like this, when, as I said, they had an initial suspect named Tyler North, and he was carried from term to term. It was very aggravating for Judge Boykin. So a one-day murder trial in his courtroom was not unusual. It was more, that was the way that it happened. If a murder happened in June, it was very common for the October session to have that one day trial and be done with it. And some of this, of course, has to do with, how the law was slanted towards prosecution during that period. There wasn't, you didn't have modern discovery, and a lot of the things that are that were protecting defendants during that time. And of course, you also had, the appeals process was pretty slick too.
I thought one of the things that was fascinating about I actually pulled and read the final opinion, and that the Supreme Court Judge Allman, I think, wrote that. And fascinating to me as a criminal defense lawyer that it was insufficiency of the evidence, because you almost never hear an appellate court say it's insufficiency of the evidence. And they had two other grounds that I think had to do with his confession or alleged confession. And I can't remember what the other one was, but there were technical grounds. If you just wanted to reverse it, you could have thrown it out. And so it was sort of shocking to say, and there's actually jury charges based on that. Your circumstantial evidence, you have to exclude every other reasonable possibility, but that's usually a jury question, as well. And so what did you think was up with the Supreme Court? Were they just wanting to put an end to it at that point? They saw what was going on and wanted to put an end to it. And what do you know about that? What can you say about that?
I just really think this case is really at the inflection point, the hinge in Jim Crow justice. If it had occurred 10 years earlier, maybe you don't find a state Supreme Court that's going to look at this and say, oh, this is a railroaded black man. But in this case, I think you're really seeing the courts turn on the idea of how justice works out for black men in during Jim Crow, during segregation. And I think that there's just a more of an openness to look and see whether or not there's equal treatment. And so in some ways, it's not that the Supreme Court found that, but that the trial court was sort of lagging behind the Supreme Court here. I mean, in truth, there is not enough evidence to have convicted Clarence Henderson once, much less 3 times on this. And it got less believable each time he came back for trial. And it was entirely circumstantial. You had to really bend over backwards to both put the gun in his hand and then explain why the gun and the bullet were different calibers.
Almost literally putting a square peg in a round hole.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and there's no motive. The situation is kind of far-fetched that a black man would be able to prowl around in a populated area of Carrollton, stalking women in lovers' lanes without being noticed, is in itself far-fetched. And then, so that he was convicted to begin with is sort of like the unbelievable thing. But I think you're right. It is something to look at a Supreme Court in 1950 batting down these trial court decisions on the basis of you did not prove this guy is guilty, regardless of what the jury said. But I do think that shows where we were at this point in history. At this point, after, we're going to see a lot of court verdicts and Supreme Court opinions that are going to start coming down that really get at sort of the basis of the injustice of segregation.
Well, I one of the questions I have thought about and posed to you is, who are the heroes and who are the villains in the book? And is the Supreme Court of Georgia a hero? Because when I read the 3 opinions, one's 1950, 51, and 52. 3 different justices wrote the opinions, but one Justice Duckworth dissented in 2 of them. And as you know, we just had the 175th anniversary of the Georgia Supreme Court. I was honored to speak during that celebration about Georgia Supreme Court and the state bar. But one of our speakers was Judge Herb Phipps, who I know you know, and he was a practicing lawyer back in 1948, 1950. And he talked about the Jim Crow laws and how he was treated as a lawyer in our courts. So when I read the Henderson v. State opinions, I couldn't believe it. I'd heard a lot about Duckworth being a bad character, but I couldn't believe we had 3 Georgia Supreme Court opinions overturning the conviction of a black man for the murder of a white hero I couldn't believe that. So I kind of felt like the Supreme Court of Georgia might be a hero in this book.
I think I could certainly see that. I mean, if nothing else, you have to sort of picture them as sort of Saul on the road to Tarsus here on this issue. You know, the scales fall from their eyes and they can see injustice when it's in front of them. But you know, I think there are a lot of, rather than heroes and villains, there's a lot of villainy and heroics in this story. And I think it is heroic that the Supreme Court could look at something that might not get a second look in an earlier configuration of that court and see it for what it was and turn it back. So yeah, I think that is because that is where we were at that time, was just right at that inflection point where courts started to really grapple with the idea that the court systems did not work for people of color.
Well, one issue that would make that so, I would think, is having the prosecutor being the brother of the judge.
That's really incredible, isn't it?
That was hard. That really, as they say, that really happened, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you take a look at that first trial, just the very first one. It occurred in one day. The appointed special prosecutor was the older brother of the sitting judge. And the courtroom was flanked by armed guards. It hardly gives the appearance of justice. And the defense counsel put on no defense, with the exception of unsworn statement by the defendant, which was just just begging for his life. So
prosecutor is the brother of the judge, but also you have an all-white jury.
All-white jury. That's
in
right.
In a Jim Crow court. You kind of know how this is going to come out.
And had always come out that way.
And had always done that.
Yeah.
So enter in the second trial, another, what I would call a hero, is Dan Duke.
True. Dan Duke is, I think, a real, almost forgotten hero.
I'd never heard of him, Chris, but man, I really enjoyed reading about him. He had,
he was of the South. He grew up in Palmetto, Georgia. He and I graduated from the same high school, not at the same time, but a few generations earlier. But he had a real crusader streak in him. He would represent Black people, and he would defend them vigorously. He would represent moonshiners and would be just as vigorous a counsel for them. I mean, he really believed that he was fighting for the little guy, the person who was oppressed. And he just loved to fight. He was just, pugnacious and, easily irritable. At one point, he punched out someone in a judge's chambers, and that's in the book. I mean, it's hard to even imagine, but that's who he was, and that's who he was his whole life. It didn't make the book, but I talked to Roy Barnes about Dan Duke, because Dan Duke would later serve as a judge for many, many years in Fulton County, and I was looking for people who knew him, and Roy Barnes had good memories of Dan Duke, of Judge Duke, and one of them was, and I forget the exact details of it now, but something that young lawyer Roy Barnes did in his courtroom so upset Dan Duke that Dan Duke had him arrested on the spot and taken off and placed in a jail cell. And that's still a story that gets that Roy Barnes enjoys telling.
So one of the things that when I talk to writer friends of mine, and I'm fortunate to have a number of writer friends, But in nonfiction, one of the things that seems like they really strive for is sort of specificity and detail, even going back decades like you did here. And it's one of the things I think lawyers have in common, because when you're given an opening statement or a closing argument, if you can lock in that sort of specificity to tell, small details. And I was really struck, like even from the very first chapter, when you describe, the murder, you talk about they're there on Lover's Lane. The flashlight comes in the window. She's walking barefoot through the pouring rain with the flashlight barely lighting the way. As a writer, how do you gather and choose and use that kind of detail?
For that particular scene, which is the bulk of the first chapter, which is the abduction and the murder, I had Nan's testimony from 3 trials. It was part of it. I also had multiple accounts that were carried in the newspapers, both in the two newspapers in Carrollton and the Atlanta Constitution. And what I did was I sort of like sifted through those accounts to come up with what was the most sort of stable account of what happened that night. I also did things like I looked at what the weather was on that day, I looked at maps to see where they were, where based on the testimony they had to have gone, how far away that it put them from the nearest houses at the time, because they had a plat of the, because this was at the development of a country club, Sunset Hills Country Club, that was still under construction. So when they get marched out from the end of a dead end road, well, that road's not a dead end anymore. So I had to go find out, well, where was that at that time? When they were marched across the field, well, there aren't any fields anymore. So where were they going? What direction? It turns out they're being marched across what is now the Sunset Hills Country Club golf course. So, I just gathered all that information and tried to piece it together as a narrative to get people into the story.
It was gripping. I mean, gripping. It kind of grabs hold of you there.
It's terrifying.
It really is. Really is.
One other thing I want to talk about that you do cover, because it's an incredible bit of history in Georgia, is the 3 governors controversy and how it plays a role with Arnell Ellis in this case. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that is such a big part of political history in Georgia. Most people who love Georgia history know about it. But it's sort of like the Dan Duke thing. Another thing, like, it's unbelievable. It's hard to imagine you literally have people trying to beat down the door of the governor's chambers in the Capitol.
Oh yeah. I mean, and I know the story of the 3 governors controversy, and have for, I guess maybe we learned about it in high school, certainly in college, learned about it. But even every time I look at it, it still is like, you sort of rub your eyes. You're like, could that actually have really happened? Because it's hard to imagine. Although I guess maybe now in this climate that we're in now it's maybe easier to imagine.
Yeah, I think after January 6th, we can understand it. But before January 6th and before the last 4 years, I would never have imagined it. But it really happened.
Yeah, really. A mob of people trying to depose one governor and install another one on the spot is, and there being this real live controversy that, again, has to be settled by the courts, by the Georgia Supreme Court, as to who was going to be governor of Georgia. I do think that it's important for the story. One, it was important because it places Dan Duke, who was an attorney for Governor Ellis Arnold, sort of in his historical period. I I think it was important for this story because it shows sort of the broken ground that Georgia politics was at that period. You had the competing example of a really progressive Southern governor like Ellis Arnold, maybe the most progressive we had ever had and maybe ever have had, against the Talmadge machine, which ran, specifically on the idea of preserving the white primary, which was the only election that mattered in Georgia, the Democratic primary, and excluding blacks from the ballot box. I mean, that kind of political upheaval was disturbing and, to no small extent, embarrassing to a lot of people in Georgia. And someone like Judge Boykin, that kind of disorder, and he was an Ellis Arnold appointee to the bench, that kind of disorder was something that was foremost in his mind. That was not the direction he wanted to see his community go in. So I think it really played a role in how the judge and the prosecutor viewed the need for establishing order and sort of rationality to government in Carrollton, if they were going to get where they wanted to go.
Right. I also think it sets the tone of the period.
Very much.
So you say, how could a man be tried for murder in one day and sentenced within the span of 8 hours, sentenced to the electric chair? When you have people like the mob like that trying to control the state, it's understandable. Right.
And it wasn't someone like Judge Boykin was less concerned about Clarence Henderson's outcome than he was about the mob. If the mob had gotten a hold of Clarence Henderson and had lynched him for, allegedly being involved in the murder of Buddy Stevens, that kind of outcome was unacceptable to people like Judge Boykin. Running him through the justice system in one day at an all-white jury under armed guard, where your older brother is the special prosecutor, was less, offensive to him because that was an orderly progression. And I think that was what he was more concerned with.
I think it's been said that if von Clausewitz was right, that war was diplomacy by other means, courtrooms and the law is politics by other means. And I think it certainly reflects that here.
Oh, I think so. Yes. Yeah. I mean, there was a lot of politics that plays out in the courtroom in this book.
So, who killed Buddy?
That's the question, isn't it? I mean, that would be the tougher book to write, really. 70 years after the fact, can I figure out did that 9mm round come out of that 38 caliber pistol, and if so, who was holding it at the time? What I can say is, there were certainly better suspects than Clarence Henderson. And one of those was the man who owned that pistol. He was a former police officer who had become a taxi driver, and he had loaned the pistol out to a friend of his, who several hours later was then accosted by a masked man and had his date sexually assaulted, and then the pistol went missing. Really, the only person who had the sort of ability to get from place to place, would be somebody like a white taxi driver,
who knew where the couples were.
Particularly he transported his friend. This was a sexual assault that occurred about 3 months prior to Buddy Stevens' murder, but he he drove his friend to meet his friend's date, gave his friend the pistol, and then shortly after, he left, his friend was attacked and had the pistol stolen. Leonard Pendergrass, was he guilty or not? I don't know, but it would certainly be where I would start looking if I were the police. And he was, in that time period, considered to be a likely suspect by just the community.
It's interesting. I always say, having been born in Cedartown, I never make fun of people from Alabama because I only missed it by about 6 miles. And I think Carrollton is an equidistance from the Alabama state line. And Esom Hill, which was in Polk County, was right over the line, was reputedly the moonshine capital of the world during World War II. And so that whole Alabama border going down from Cedartown down to Phoenix City, Alabama, was just sort of a bootlegger's paradise because you could run across state lines and they get after you, go over on the other side of the line and whatever else. And so it sounds like there were a ton of bootleggers and gamblers that were just sort of the usual suspects in Carrollton. And with the African American bootleggers and suspects at the top of the list, it seemed like for a while that just everybody they stopped, where were you the night this murder, happened? Because we think you were capable of it, sort of thing.
Right. Well, I think that the white police at the time, when it came to finding a black suspect, they would just grab the black community and shake, and wait for something to rattle out. So that's why I think, there was a dragnet that went well beyond Carrollton and Carroll County, where any black man was a suspect in Buddy Stevens' murder. And people were held without charges in secret prisons. And that's, that sounds kind of wild, like something out of a spy novel or something, but that's in fact what was going on, is that they were being taken out of the county, held where their family didn't know where they were, without charges, and essentially just sweated, most likely physically abused, because that was very common during the time, until they came up with a suspect. And eventually Clarence Henderson would be that suspect, probably because at some point somebody is going to give up, somebody in their own community that they're like, I don't like Clarence Henderson anyway. And because he was a rough guy. He was a brawler and a moonshiner and a gambler, and known to be sort of trouble. And so eventually the community spit him out to relieve the tension on them. And that's no way to get justice, but that is a way that machine worked.
Chris, in the book, you talk a lot about the coverage, the press, how they covered these 3 trials, how they, as you said, it was kind of breathless coverage on the first trial, but by the third trial, it barely got a paragraph in the paper. And then, of course, I've read a couple of pieces of the editorials that Stanley Parkman wrote, but I'm wondering, with the trials we've seen this past year, with the trials of the McMichaels down in Glenn County for the death of Ahmaud Arbery, and with the trial of Derek Chauvin for the death of George Floyd up in Minneapolis, I'm wondering if you can give us your take on how the media coverage in these murder trials is compared to back then. And do you think it's fair? Do you think it's slanted? Are journalists doing their job, their duty, as you see it as a journalist?
Well, I do. I think so. I mean, but we have so many different kinds of outlets that get involved in this kind of coverage. We have television news, we have print, we have a lot of online only news publications, and a lot of these have come at it with a perspective. And I'm not, coming from a traditional media outlet, I'm not real comfortable with that kind of reporting. But I think if you take a look at the mainstream press, I think the coverage of those trials was good, because one, you have a lot of expertise in covering criminal justice in the mainstream press. You had a lot of people like, in the case of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, we sent Bill Rankin there, and Bill Rankin is as good in the nation as you're going to find in covering courtroom trials. There's not much that he's going to miss. He understands the broader context and consequences of the trials, things that are happening outside the courtroom that are important. And so I think, in the Arbery trial, for instance, I think, what Bill did and what a lot of the outlets did in covering that, I think it was fine coverage. Now, what's that going to look like in 70 years? I don't know. I know when I was looking at the Henderson trials, I was really interested in what the local press had to say, because they were going to have a real sense of the pulse of the community. More than just what was said in the courtroom, I was going to know sort of how the community felt about it by looking at the local press. But when I looked at the Black press, I was going to have a sense of sort of what the national stakes were from a civil rights standpoint. Did the trial of this one sharecropper in Carrollton matter to people in Chicago or Pittsburgh? And if so, why? And you get that from that perspective from the Black press. You also got it from the New York Times. You could get a sense if the New York Times started mirroring the Pittsburgh Courier, which was an African American owned newspaper, then you knew something larger is happening in the culture.
Do you think the local press, with regard to the Clarence Henderson coverage, the local press wrote to persuade, or were they really just writing to reflect the community's views?
I think that certainly, if you take a look at Stanley Parkman's Georgian, he had an agenda for Carrollton. We know that because he wrote it in the newspaper in every edition. It was the Georgian agenda, which was for a progressive, a progressive Southern community. In the coverage of those trials, I think what came out was a reflection of sort of the fear that this kind of crime and this kind of trial and all the elements that were injected into the community, I think you could see sort of the fear and paranoia that it was creating in the community. When the communists and Black attorneys start coming into Carrollton, Georgia, this is entirely new, and really sort of the fears of what this is going to portend for a community that's trying to pull itself up sort of come through in that coverage. And while I'm talking about it, I really want to talk about a little bit when we talk about sort of like heroes. Mm-hmm. Imagine being, Clarence Henderson, after his first trial and through his second trial, had two Black attorneys, S.S. Robinson and E. Moore, both of them attorneys on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, and they did tremendous work throughout the 50s and 60s on civil rights issues. But imagine if you are them walking in to the courthouse in Carroll County to defend this Black man who has been accused of killing a white boy while in the process of sexually assaulting a white woman. Those guys were heroes.
Yeah, it took courage for them even just to walk into the courthouse, probably.
Right. And the Black bar in Atlanta, was filled with these heroes during this period. Practicing law in conditions that are sort of unfathomable now. And in one case, being threatened by the prosecutor. for just trying to prepare a defense. Don't talk to my witnesses. I will have you will get killed.
That was some rough reading. I remember that passage and some very rough language and rough reading to think what they were subjected to.
Right. And so Robinson and Moore, although sadly, when you're dealing with largely white media, they don't show up as much as you'd like them to. You don't hear their voices. And when they prepared for the second trial, one of the things they did is they went and hired Dan Duke to come in as their co-counsel. And Dan Duke essentially was the only voice you hear in the second trial, because I think smartly they looked at the situation and said, we need a white lawyer to talk to this white jury. And Dan Duke, to his credit, was willing to do that. But it was Moore and Robinson and their brainpower behind that, particularly in that second trial, that provided a really, I think, a very effective defense for Henderson, even if it didn't matter to the jury that much.
Right.
Well, and it's rare in my experience that retrials go better for the defendant. Usually they go worse for the defendant. But I frequently think about what you're talking about. I love, Thurgood Marshall was always sort of a hero of mine, and he'd leave Harlem to come south, and his dad had been a train porter, and he would sit and sip bourbon, and the porters would bring him bourbon while he looked at the file. But he got to go back to Harlem, where there was a rich black culture, booming really even at that time. And these guys you're talking about down on Auburn Avenue, they're still here in Georgia, living where they've argued this case,
and just scraping by. I mean, going to churches and asking that preachers, go to their congregations and
pass the hat.
Yeah, pass the hat for the defense,
Mm-hmm.
And still really unable to get the sort of the things that they really wanted for a vigorous defense. One of the things I really wanted to get across in the sections where I do talk about Thurgood Marshall and the National NAACP is what a shoestring operation they were running, and how hard it was for them to work simultaneously on big civil cases attacking sort of the bedrock of segregation, while also trying to put out these fires of these individual, largely black men who are accused in Jim Crow courtrooms all around the South. There were a lot of people inside the NAACP who were advising that they not provide defense of these black criminal defendants, but Thurgood Marshall felt like he couldn't turn his back on them. And Clarence Henderson was one of those. And he was able to lend what aid he could, but, they were, I went to the NAACP archives in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and started going through their files there. And I think any lawyer would appreciate 90% of the documents had to do with billing. It was really, though, an attempt to extract whatever money that they could get, raise whatever money they could, so they could move on to the next case. Do just the simple things to get some of these cases moving forward. And
they had to have been stretched very thinly,
very, very, very much.
Way too much work for what they had.
Which is why somebody like Dan Duke was such a powerful ally to have. Because he was in a much more privileged position, and could have more effectively argue for adequate funding for the defense and things like that. He had a louder voice in that sense. So I mean, the partnership between Duke and the NAACP was really beneficial for some defendants like Clarence Henderson.
So is there going to be an audio book?
There is an audiobook, yes. And in fact, It should be available simultaneous with, last I heard, simultaneous with the print edition. Had an opportunity to, choose from 3 narrators. It was really wild. I've learned so much about the publishing industry. And that was one of the interesting things is they're like, here are 3 people pick who's going to read your book, and they were reading a selection.
You've got a great voice. I think you could do it yourself.
I agree.
I wasn't offered, but I was willing to do it if need be. But frankly, when they sent me the samples, all three of the guys that I heard reading my words sounded better than I sounded to myself. So it was going to be really hard for me to say, no, I can do it better than this professional voice actor. But I was a little worried that, this being a first book, that there wouldn't be an audiobook right away, but it looks like we are going to have that. So
right. That's great.
And the book is officially out
January 11th.
January 11th. And I take it all outlets where you get books, it'll be available.
Exactly. Brought to you
Audible,
by
Amazon, all
Amazon.
those.
And
yep. Abrams Books has been great to work with. And I'm looking forward to that day when it's available everywhere.
Awesome. We're looking forward to it too. I highly recommend. I really enjoyed reading it, Chris. It was just fascinating to me. I learned a lot. I learned a lot about the underbelly of racism in Georgia back then, things I didn't like, but also learned a lot about some really, really neat heroes in Georgia. So my hat's off to you. I thought you did a great job, and I'm recommending it to all my book clubs.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Let me know if the book clubs need the author to zoom in on them or something. Great. I'd be happy to do it. I can't tell you, anytime, and this is sort of like anytime I hear somebody who's read the book, I said, it's sort of like seeing an animal you've only ever seen in the zoo out in the wild. You're like, wow, somebody's read the book, in their living room instead of me just staring at it in the screen. It's just amazing for me. And it was also terrifying to have people with great legal minds reading, a book that had so much going on in courtrooms. So I'm just so happy that you enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's outstanding. And I think the other thing too, as you sort of alluded to earlier, when you and Robin were talking about heroes, so many people who, nobody that you would characterize as a hero, and probably nobody that you would characterize as a villain, really thought that's what they were becoming at that time, in place. And I'm reminded of that, the Baptist hymn, once to every man and nation, new occasions teach new duties. And so I think it's important to read stuff like this, because it teaches us that we're in a part where, history is going to judge us one day.
Oh yeah. And we can't see how that's going to happen. The great historian of the South, C. Van Woodward, I always think about how he described the South as a man on a cliff. From your perspective, you could see where he needed to go, but from his perspective, all he could see was the next place to put his hand. And that is the case with so many of these people in this book. I really wanted to portray them as the people they were, and, misguided sometimes making, brave choices, sometimes, not the hero that you'd want them to be. But that's who they were. You could have somebody, and we didn't talk about him, but the editor of the Constitution at the time, Ralph McGill, who was, canonized in my building at the AJC, it was also a virulent anti-communist and red baiter, and so the role that he plays in this book is not his most flattering, because he's really sort of counterbalancing his progressive views on race with a really angry approach towards anti-communism.
Yeah, I put a question mark by his name, saying surprising. I'd only heard of him in the good light.
Right.
And this book portrayed him, a part of him that I'd never even heard of. And so that was really interesting to see. And that's why I say they're products of their times. They're ambiguous. They're complicated. They're not all one thing.
Yeah. And yeah, exactly. And they have their motivations of the moment, and, how it's viewed 70 years later is not something they're thinking about. For somebody like McGill, he was really concerned that, the communists were a menace, a red menace, but it was also a way to give him cover to continue to be progressive on issues of race by also being staunchly anti-communist.
Not unlike the NAACP.
Not unlike the NAACP. Not unlike a lot of us.
Super complex. Yeah. Well, Chris, it's been wonderful talking with you about your book. And for everyone listening, to remind you, it's The 3 Death Sentences of Clarence Henderson, coming out on January 11. It'll be available, and we're excited about it. Chris, we ask every guest of ours to end our session with their definition or notion of justice. And so I put that question to you. What is your definition or notion of justice? How do you see justice?
Oh, yeah, I've been waiting on that. Yeah, and I have given some thought to it, and particularly how it relates to this story. I think one definition of justice could be the actions that do the greatest good while causing the least amount of harm. Because in every instance, every action is going to have ripples. And I think you see a lot of people in this story who are trying to address an injustice in the death of Buddy Stevens, but in fact are creating further injustices. I mean, it was what happened to Clarence Henderson should never happen to an American. He should never have been put in the position he was in. It was an injustice, and it did not correct the injustice of Buddy Stevens' death. I think those actions that we take that correct that balance is where we find real justice.
All right.
It's great.
Yeah.
Great book. Great guest, Chris. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Just to remind everyone, we've been talking with Chris Joyner. He's works with the AJC. He's an investigative journalist there. You can follow his articles on ajc.com. You can learn more about Chris on his LinkedIn page, and you can follow Chris on Twitter at CJoyner, CJOYNER. Chris Joyner, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, Robin, as you know, we always try to share some piece of news coverage or a story from somewhere that we see that involves trials or involves the law. And so mine today comes from Vanity Fair magazine. It's a December 8th, 2021 article by someone named Gabriel Sherman, a writer for Vanity Fair, and it's about the Ghislaine Maxwell trial. And I noted the December the 8th, 2021 date because we're now well past that and actually have a verdict, which was a guilty verdict. There was I think one count that there was a not guilty verdict on, but a predominantly guilty verdict. And in this article, Mr. Sherman writes, and it's entitled, "The Prosecution is Fumbling Its Case Against Ghislaine Maxwell." And in it, he writes that it's shocking and tragic that the prosecution's case against Maxwell appears far weaker than many people expected. The list of prosecutorial missteps is long. Victims have appeared unprepared for cross-examination. High-profile co-conspirators have not yet been called to testify about Maxwell's alleged role in the Epstein child sex trafficking operation. On Tuesday, prosecutors stunned reporters in the courthouse viewing room by announcing that the government intends to rest its case before Friday, weeks earlier than anticipated. It all raises the painful question, will Maxwell go free? He goes on to say that he was dismayed, for instance, that the prosecutor, Laura Pomerantz, opening statement ran 35 minutes, roughly 10 minutes less than the government's opening argument in the Elizabeth Holmes fraud trial by comparison. And he was underwhelmed that prosecutors did not first call the alleged victim as their first witness and instead led off with Epstein's pilot, Larry Vysotsky. The perception in the viewing room was that Vysotsky testified more like a defense witness, claiming he never saw sex acts with underage girls or sexual activity on Epstein's planes. Well, we now know that the jury has spoken, that these perceptions by the media, the being aghast in the viewing room was not the same reaction that jurors had. Jurors took a long time to come up with the verdict. There was some thought that they might have a hung jury for a while, but indeed the prosecution won this case. And so one of the reasons that I picked this article today is because it goes to show that truthfully in a jury trial, the people who matter in a jury trial are those that actually sit on the jury and listen to the evidence, and not what's reported in the media. And it's often, I think, in vogue among not just writers for Vanity Fair magazine, but among lawyers like ourselves to second guess and, they would have had a longer this and they would have done longer. It also goes to show, as I had a professor in college used to say, V does not equal V. Volume is not always a virtue. And so it's not always a virtue to have a long, complicated case. Sometimes a quick case that meets all the elements is all that you need. And we're frequently Monday morning quarterbacking people when they lose trials. And I thought it was important to maybe bring this Saturday night quarterbacking before the game was actually played to the attention of our viewers, our listeners.
Yeah, good point. I heard a lot of prognosticators on TV saying what they thought the verdict was going to be and all that sort of thing. And I don't know about you, Lester, but I we both tried a lot of cases. I don't know about you, but when a jury comes back in, they're looking right at us. I still don't know how they're going to come out until they read the verdict form. Right. So if and I'm the one who tried the case. So if somebody says I can predict what a jury's going to do, I think is a bunch of they're in charge. The jury's in charge, and they'll let you know. And they're the people who matter, not the prognosticators. Yeah,
it reminded me a little bit about my son and I were talking the other day about all the punditry around college football, right now. And, there's fewer and fewer games left. We're down to one game. And, as the actual games go down, the amount of punditry about all of those and what people are saying goes up. And I said, when all is said and done, there's a lot more said than there is actually done. And I think that's certainly true of these trials. And we've had 3 pretty high profile trials, that have gone on here recently. We had the Holmes case, which the article alluded to. We had the Potter case, which was in Minnesota, which was the police officer who said she mistaked her pistol for a taser. And then you had the Maxwell trial. So you got a lot of trial watching, going on. And it is interesting to look and follow closely what's going on, but it's horrible to predict.
Yeah, horrible to predict. And so I try not to. I just pray for the right result. And by the way, I know I've lost trials also, but I usually think the jury gets it right.
I think that's true. It's I am fond of channeling Winston Churchill and saying that the jury system is really the worst system in the world, except for all others, sort of like democracy. And when you look at places where we don't have jury trials, and of course, that's one of our missions, at the Civil Justice Foundation, who sponsors us, is to make sure that people understand how important it is, because in places like England, unless you've been slandered, you don't get a civil jury trial.
Yeah. Big difference. My talk today is just a really short story about former United States Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And there's been a newspaper article that all of her books are going to be auctioned off. She has an entire first edition collection of books by some fiction writers like Toni Morrison, Gloria Steinem. She's even got a first edition book by the late Justice Antonin Scalia, who is one of her best friends. They're going online going for auction online starting January 19. She has more than 1,000 books, and some of that even includes law reviews that she wrote and signed by, quote, Ruth, just signed Ruth. So that's very interesting to me. They're going up for auction, and the low end estimate for the entire collection over 1,000 books is $60,000. I'm going to keep my eye on that because I think it's going to be much, much more. I think people want to have a book that sat on the bookshelf of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, just to have that connection. She became one of the most famous Supreme Court justices I can recall. I mean, people got RBG tattoos and wear dissenting earrings and that sort of thing. So I think it's going to be much higher, and I'm going to keep an eye on that. But I just thought that was interesting that even in death, people want to still be connected to Justice Ginsburg.
It's and if the pundits are right there, and it is $60,000 on the whole collection, you might pick up a nice bargain by bidding on it.
Absolutely.
I wonder too, as I sit here, and of course our readers can't see where I'm at my house, but I've got law books back behind me, and I think that's probably going the way of medieval armor. Where nobody's using books anymore; it's all over computers. Right. So it will be interesting to see actual books that belong to a great lawyer and a great justice.
Yeah. Well, Lester, that was a great discussion with Chris Joyner. You got anything else?
I don't think so. I think that was a great way to start off 2022. And
I agree.
I do hope our listeners will go get that book when it comes out in the next couple of days.
Me too. I want to end by saying we want to thank our sponsor, the Georgia Civil Justice System. And we also want to thank our producer. We don't say his name enough, but we've got a great producer, Raz Misher. We thank him. And so for our listeners, just to let you know, you can find out more about Lester Tate at his website, his law firm website, aikentate.com. And you find out more about me, Robin Fraser Clark, at gatriallawyers.net. And you can always reach our podcast and some documents related to our guest at seeyouincourt.squarespace.com. So we hope you will subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends and family. So until next time,
we'll see you in court.
See you in court.
Thank you for listening to See You in Court, brought to you by the Georgia Civil Justice Foundation and the Georgia Institute of Technology. Please subscribe to this podcast and consider writing a review. You may find related documents to this week's episode on our website, seeyouincourt.podbean.com. Please send any questions, suggestions, or ideas to seeyouincourtpodcast@gmail.com. The producer of this podcast is Raz Misher. We thank Noreen Hassan, Associate Professor and Director of Outreach and Community Engagement of the Georgia Institute of Technology School of Literature, Media, and Communication, and the Georgia Tech students who help bring you this podcast. I'm Fred Smith, Executive Director of the Georgia Civil Justice Foundation. You may learn more about the foundation at fairplay.org. On behalf of Robin Fraser Clark and Lester Tate, until our next episode, we'll see you in court.